Hello, and welcome to Psychedelic Seminars. I'm your host, Mike Margolies. Thanks for being here. I'm really excited for today's interview. First, I want to say some thank yous. A really big thank you to our sponsor, Robert Barnhart. Those of you who don't know who Robert is, he's been behind the scenes a really good force in the psychedelic community, supporting projects like this one. He has a film called A New Understanding, The Science of Psilocybin, which our guest today is actually a part of, who I'll introduce momentarily. And if you haven't gotten a chance to check it out yet, if you enjoyed this interview, I think you'll enjoy the film as well. It's available for free on YouTube, and so you can check that out. We'll put the link in the show notes. And if you would like to support this project, we want to keep making more of these interviews. We want to keep them free, available to the public. You can support us on Patreon, which is our monthly crowdfunder, and you can find that at patreon.com/psychsems, patreon.com/psychsems. Thank you for your support. And with that, I'm very excited to introduce my guest today. My guest probably needs no introduction, as David Letterman might say. This is Bill Richards, and so Bill, thank you for having me in your home here today. It's a real honor to be here with you and to be able to sit and do this interview. I'll give maybe like the brief story arc of your career, and then we can drill into. So you've been at psychedelic research since 1963. Some of it in the early days was also here in Baltimore, and you saw the whole arc from the early days to the shutdown, and then you were a big part of actually getting psychedelic research restarted to the renaissance that we're seeing today. I mean, that work was 20 years ago. You were doing this work, restarting as a founding member of the Hopkins Psychedelic research team. And until today, that same Hopkins team has now received $17 million in funding to become the biggest psychedelic research center in the world. And along the way, your work has been very tied to the mystical experience. Your book, Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics and Religious Experiences, documents a lot of that. And a lot of your research has involved those tie-ins between the mystical experience and the therapeutic outcomes. So you've had a really deep career in the psychedelic space. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks.
Yeah.
And it's an honor to see the so-called psychedelic renaissance happening,
Yeah.
We still have lots of hard work to do, but it's very hopeful.
Yeah, you've seen the whole arc, right?
Yeah.
I would love to actually hear your story there, or the story, your personal story, and the story of the movement that you've seen. What was it like in the early days, and then through that shutdown to today?
Well, in some ways they parallel each other. Back in 1963, when I was a 23-year-old graduate student in Göttingen in Germany, I had not yet heard the word psychedelic,
Right.
much less psilocybin. And Hans Karl Leuner was doing research with psilocybin in the psychiatric clinic that was right behind where I was living. And he was looking for research volunteers. And the rumor was that there was some new drug that enabled you to remember things from early childhood. And I thought, gee, that sounded interesting. I was studying my dreams at that time, and I thought maybe I'd get some deeper understanding of my Oedipal complex or something. And I remember walking over it and asking if I could be a part of the research. And are you in good physical health? Do you get drunk very often? I didn't. You're in. And they took me down to this little basement room with a cot, an end table, and a little narrow window looking out over the hospital garbage cans, and gave me an injection of a derivative of psilocybin called CZ74. and left me alone.
So you had no idea.
I had no idea. And I think what saved me was the piety of my Methodist childhood. You know, I kind of decided that if any terrible insights about my relationship with my mother were going to emerge, God would be with me, you know? And there was this sense of trust and openness and curiosity, which now we know is really critical,
Right,
you know,
right.
for helpful responses. But anyway, all of a sudden, my consciousness just opened and opened and opened to this exquisitely beautiful, what we now would call a mystical or transcendental state that I didn't even know was possible.
Right.
And I was one awestruck young man, you know. I remember when the psychiatric resident who gave me the drug came in and to check on me, I said, "And what was that drug you gave me? How do you spell it?" Psilocybine. And in many ways, the rest of my life has been footnotes to that experience.
Right,
you know?
that really launched it off.
Yeah, so I became known in the clinic. There was that interesting American who had the mystical experience.
So was that unusual for there to be a mystical experience?
Yeah, they were using very low dosage.
Okay.
And no support, no preparation, no integration, no music, no plants.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And
Set and setting wasn't.
Leuna had just written a book called The Experimental Psychosa, The Experimental Psychoses, because most people had these paranoid, panic, disturbed reactions. And the thought was that these drugs might help us understand schizophrenia better.
Right, they were known as psychotomimetics back then.
Right, it was very much that phase. So I had the honor of really participating in the discovery of supportive set and setting in Germany.
Right.
And so in some subsequent experience, triggered by the arrival of my friend Wally Pankey from who had done the Good Friday study.
Right.
We did an experiment where we moved me upstairs and used some music and brought a few plants in, and Wally stayed there to hold my hand if I needed it. And
was this in Germany or Baltimore?
in Germany.
Okay.
Yeah, this is still in Germany. Yeah. And Dr. Lerner was very impressed at how different the results were.
Yeah, you and Walter both worked on this mystical experience in different ways. The Good Friday experiment being, this really famous one, which, I guess for folks who don't know, right, they had a chapel and they had, some people were given psilocybin, some people weren't during a Good Friday service. It was kind of an infamous experiment that he did.
Yeah, it was the first well-designed double-blind study.
Right.
Some got psilocybin and some got nicotinic acid, which just kind of gives a warm, tingling sensation.
An active placebo.
Right, active placebo, but with the same expectation and the same setting. And believe it or not, those who got the psilocybin as a whole had mystical type experiences, and those who got nicotinic acid did not, you know?
Right.
And so it proved or indicated anyway that more is involved in suggestion and expectation and wish fulfillment, that there really is something about this psilocybin molecule that is incredibly sacred.
Right. And then did you and Walter together develop this mystical experience questionnaire that was used to figure out, like, hey, do people have this experience or not?
Yeah, well, you know, how do you, research-wise, how do you decide if a so-called mystical experience happened
mystical
or
experience,
not? You know?
How do we quantify that in science?
And Wally, in his thesis at Harvard, defined it in actually 9 categories that we condensed subsequently
like,
to 6, but unity, transcendence of time and space, intuitive knowledge, sacredness, deeply felt positive mood, and ineffability and paradoxicality. That when you try to talk about it, it's very hard to put it into words, you know? And so he designed a questionnaire to try to measure that or indicate whether or not it occurred. And then when we both moved to Baltimore to work at Spring Grove from Boston, we were working with alcoholics who weren't all that well educated, many of them. So we simplified the wording and condensed some of the items.
Right.
And that became the Psychedelic Experience Questionnaire that has subsequently had all kinds of different names, from Peak Experience Questionnaire, States of Consciousness Questionnaire. But it's a valuable, and now it's condensed to just the core mystical items. At Hopkins, we call it the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. But it really is one way of determining what type of experience happened and whether and to what degree of completeness or intensity this transcendental awareness occurred.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing as we're talking about, you know, the ineffable, right? Experiences of God, and which normally is kind of in a different realm than what science is in, and this kind of married them in an interesting way. There's a way of actually quantifying this mystical thing in a way that's measurable and we can show it. And that was one of the big papers that came out at Hopkins initially, you know, that psilocybin can occasion these mystical experiences. So it's really interesting. It is funny. I'll never forget the moment. I think, as you know, I was in one of the studies at Hopkins, and I got to say, I was tripping really hard on psilocybin. And when they turned the music down and they asked me the first question, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how ineffable is this experience? So that's an interesting question. Put it at 1 to 10, how much can I not describe? So it's
apologies.
It was a very funny moment. I wonder though, because, you know, does that influence what, you know, do people now have a mystical experience because they're being asked about the mystical experience and being set up for it? Does that influence them?
I don't think so. We intentionally do not mention our definition of mystical experiences.
Right, distracted questions.
I mean, if someone wants to go to the web, they can find the information there. It's out there in different articles. They can read my book. And, but we don't stress it. Especially because some people may receive a placebo or a very low dose, and we don't want to build in a big disappointment reaction for those people. We want them to get all the goodness out of the participation in the study that they can. So we may say, well, you know, sometimes people have incredibly meaningful experiences that many people use the word sacred to describe. And some may speak of it in religious language. Some may prefer a more philosophical or scientific language, you know. But you need to know that there's a chance that something very meaningful might occur. And sometimes those experiences are preceded by a feeling as though you're dying or you're going crazy, you know. And that's why, in order to prepare you as responsibly as we can, we need to say, you know, like, if you should feel like you're dying, go ahead and die. You know, or if you think you're going crazy or you're melting or dissolving, whatever it is, go with it. Other people have experienced the same thing. Their bodies are just fine. The heart keeps beating, the lungs keep breathing, and you will come back at the end of the day. But I think informed consent requires that people are prepared for that. Otherwise, it can be really terrifying for someone who has never taken a psychedelic
It can be
in
terrifying.
moderate or high dose, because
Yeah.
it feels incredibly real.
Yeah, it does. And yeah, it's that'll submit. The only way out is through. Or I think
Yeah.
as you put it, trust, let go, be open.
Yeah, trust, let go, be open, in and through.
Right, right.
Let the music carry you.
Right.
You know? Yeah.
And yeah, so a lot of the experience today at Hopkins is building off of that early work that you were doing.
That's right.
And I actually love to explore that more, because you were doing all this work on mystical experiences back in the day, and then it got shut down for a couple of decades. What was that? And you were one of the last, if not the last person to actually legally give a
Yes.
psychedelic to somebody before it got shut. So yeah, so what was that whole era like?
Well, the early research at Spring Grove, where I was involved for 10 years, from 67 to 77, was very exciting. We had a growing team. The state of Maryland built a whole new research center designed really for psychedelic research.
Yeah.
I can still see us sitting around the conference table,
Yeah.
Debating how we were going to train all the hordes of therapists that would be needed in a few years.
And Stan Groff was there too?
Yeah,
at one point, right?
Stan came the same time I did, actually.
Wow.
But he left in 73.
Okay.
But the research continued till 77. And, Wally Pankey and Charles Savage and Al Kurland and John Reed and Rich Jensen and others, it was a very dedicated, exciting time. But then, the staff got smaller, and we wrote grants that were approved but not funded,
Okay. So,
And the federal government really never stopped our research.
Okay.
When it finally stopped, it was a decision of the University of Maryland administrators that this was just too controversial, and we direct attention elsewhere. But it was really the social pressures of the time that put the research on hold. So it got down to me and two secretaries, and then, as I say, it became two secretaries.
what was the last thing you were studying before the last?
Well, we had some wonderful projects.
Yeah.
We had what we called a referred patient project, where clinicians in the area could bring people in where they felt the patient was at an impasse, and be present in a psilocybin session as a co-therapist with us guiding.
Wow. Wow.
And just see if it would.
Wow. So just generally someone who's stuck.
Yeah. Really get therapy going again, and then the referring therapist would carry the ball.
Wow.
We had a comparative study with dipropyltryptamine and psilocybin with cancer patients.
Wow. This
Blinded.
is for the existential anxiety.
Yeah, to see if one substance might be more effective than another.
Right.
We had our work with religious professionals and mental health professionals, where people could come for a training experience, up to 2 or 3 LSD sessions usually. It was perfectly legal and supported by the FDA. And a lot of people came through that study and just wanted to experience a psychedelic under ideally safe and well-designed conditions, So lots was going on.
Yeah.
But then it did get dormant for precisely 22 years until Roland Griffiths and I were able to begin at Hopkins. And the only exception in the early '90s, Rick Strassman did
DMT.
a little bit of work with DMT
Right.
in New Mexico,
Right.
but that
Well,
was limited in
Right.
its scope, but
And
still.
you it was kind of quiet for a while, right? The first few
Yeah.
years, you were secretly restudying psilocybin.
Yeah. Yeah, I think our friend Rick Doblin didn't know we were doing our first study until it was almost done. But also, we didn't want to evoke any controversy.
Right.
You know, we wanted to get the study done, publish it,
Right.
and then it's out there in the world.
Right.
You know, and not talk about what we're about to do or what we hope to do or
Right.
what we want to do. So we just quietly did this double-blind study with normal volunteers in the Baltimore, Washington area who had never taken a psychedelic before.
Right.
And I can hardly remember the design. I think there was a high dose and a low dose control, and then eventually those who had the low dose could get a high dose later. But it really demonstrated that there's something very unique about the high dose. It kind of repeated and validated the Good Friday study.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, this was all building off of the old research, right? And you were the bridge, really, from the early days of research, looking at these mystical experiences and then bringing that back. So thanks for being that bridge, because that role is
been an honor.
Yeah.
I couldn't have done it without Roland. Roland Griffiths said that he hadn't worked with psychedelics, but he was very interested in altered states through meditation.
Right.
He had studied Siddha yoga, and he was an expert, still is, a world expert in caffeine. And he was a full professor and highly respected and had very good relations with the FDA. And so he was well established in the Hopkins community. And I happened to have the clinical, practical knowledge of how to work with psychedelics and how to design the space and prepare people and guide people, which I had been doing ever since Lerner's Clinic, So we've worked very well together over the years.
Yeah, and it's been like 20 years now?
20 years,
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know how that happened.
And it's interesting, right? That first study you put out was all on healthy normals.
That's right.
And it was
And our
purely about,
second study was healthy normals,
it
really.
was just about the mystical experience.
Yeah, the second one was a dose response study of just giving four different doses in an inactive placebo,
Right.
And just seeing what people reported and, surprised the transcendental mystical experiences tended to go with a higher dosage,
Right.
But,
Surprise,
many would say, well, of course, but it needed to be demonstrated in a scientific framework, and we did that. So.
And then you did these cancer studies, and I guess these were redoing some studies that already had happened.
That's right.
In the old days of taking people with cancer diagnosis.
That's
who had
right.
Existential depression, anxiety.
Right.
And let's
helping people live more fully till they die. Just because you're terminally ill doesn't mean you have to be depressed. You know? And that's some of the most meaningful experiences I've had as a therapist. There's something about dealing with people who are approaching their death. They don't mess around. They know what's important and what's not.
Right. Right.
And there's a connection, intensity of honesty, And not everyone has a mystical experience in the first session. Some do. Some have more interpersonal, psychodynamic types of experiences that are also very helpful. But as a whole, the people who go through that form of therapy, which may only be receiving psilocybin once or sometimes twice, report decreased anxiety, decreased depression, closer interpersonal relationships, and less preoccupation with pain. And they'll say, well, the pain is still there, but it doesn't bother me like it did before, you know? And the most amazing thing is that many people, especially those who have these mystical type experiences, will claim that they've lost the fear of death, that they're approaching death now more with a sense of curiosity than fear. They don't want to speed it up. Right. You know, they're not suicidal at all, but somehow they feel more at home in the universe. There's a kind of deep sense of security and safety that comes from the memory of this, you know, brief experience that may have just been a minute or two even in a 6-hour period of time when psilocybin was active. Yeah. It's a whole new concept in medicine, really. Right. That it's not that you have to keep taking your antidepressant medication day after day for the rest of your life to cover up the symptoms or whatever. But it's the memory of an incredibly meaningful state of consciousness. Right.
And then it's not a biochemical thing, it's an experience.
That stays with you.
Yeah.
That you can tap into.
Yeah.
And that's pretty incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. So those outcomes of, you know, people coming back with a different perspective, that was very closely correlated to the mystical experience.
Yes. Yeah, not exclusively, but those who report mystical experience, it's hard to put into language. Yeah. It's not even...
It's ineffable, you would say?
Yeah. You don't quite say, I had a mystical experience.
Right.
You know, am I ever important, you know?
Right.
Because when mystical experiences happen, generally there's no I there. Your everyday personality kind of dissolves, merges into a unitive consciousness. And then there's a sense of your everyday personality reforming as the drug wears off, but the memory remains.
Right.
So you can say, well, I remember what this incredibly beautiful, meaningful, eternal state of consciousness was like. Right. But you don't claim it as a possession, like I own it now, or I experienced it. You know,
it's, I'm enlightened.
Yeah, now I'm enlightened. Yeah. No, but I know I've had a peek at what enlightenment might mean.
Right.
To really be spiritually awake, to know that there really is an eternal dimension to human consciousness. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
That's pretty profound stuff.
It is.
You know?
And this, as far as, you know, if we want to talk about the therapeutic use of this kind of experience, right? Not only cancer patients, but addiction is another big area.
Right, addictions, depression. Who knows what the unexplored. The potential with sociopathic personalities, especially young people, who there's something when you have one of these profound mystical experiences, and there's love and beauty and a sense of interconnectedness with other people, that you belong to the family of man, if you will.
Right.
That one could theorize could form a basis of ethics.
Sure, yeah. So this isn't a given, though, right? That you're just going to take psilocybin and you're going to have this mystical experience.
That's right.
And, you know, as you were mentioning earlier, there is a whole lot of the set and setting that goes into it. So if you were to set someone up for an optimal psychedelic experience, what does it actually look like? What does it look like in the Hopkins studies, and in your experience, even more broadly? What is the best environment? How do you personally show up as a therapist?
Yeah. Most important, I believe, is what I call interpersonal grounding of a trust-filled relationship with another human being. Perhaps your therapist or your guide, but where you can genuinely be yourself with no defenses. You can have beautiful experiences or difficult experiences.
Right.
There's nothing to prove.
Right.
But a sense of safety and grounding in a relationship. And then you couple that with some instruction in how to navigate in the inner world. Just as if you were going to, as I mentioned in my book, if you were going to go downhill skiing for the first time, it's good to have a little instruction before you jump on your skis and start going down.
Right.
And that includes things like not trying to think and control rationally during the experience, but to kind of collect experiences and then reflect on them with words and language afterwards.
Right.
It entails being ready to meet, receive, embrace whatever your mind brings to you.
Right.
Whether it looks pleasant or unpleasant or beautiful or scary. So like if something threatening appears, here's this dragon or monster or boogeyman or devil or whatever, instead of running from it, what happens if you run from it, right?
It chases you.
It gets bigger, you get smaller,
Right.
Yeah. And you wake up in a cold sweat, scared to go to sleep again, So instead you say, well, you dig in your heels.
Right.
And you look it in the eye and you say, boy, are you ever big and scary. Yeah. But what are you doing in my mind?
Right.
Why are you here? What are you made of? What can I learn from you? And you reach out for the hand of your companion or therapist if you need it, and you go towards what looks threatening. Almost like you dive into the eyeball, the pupil of the monster, as if you were diving into a swimming pool, okay?
Right.
And when you do that, that intention, that act of courage, the monster always gives up its identity.
Yep.
It turns into your drunken father in the middle of the night when you were a kid, or the person who sexually abused you, or some collection of anxieties that you've been harboring for a long time, of self-doubts or whatever it is. But when you go towards it, there's meaning.
Right.
What's terrifying one minute you can laugh at, sometimes the next,
Yeah. And this is such an important point, right? That it's not just
right. So there
psilocybin.
needs to be that kind of intention of training to know how to navigate in the inner world.
Right.
Trust, let go, be open, let the music carry you.
Right.
Right. Don't run from anything,
Right.
And then the setting, the physical and interpersonal setting, needs to be safe, confidential. It's nice if it's aesthetically pleasing, even though your eyes may be closed most of the time. Some sense of order and beauty and care. And if you have to get up and go to the bathroom, that there's some sense of privacy and confidentiality, and that no unknown people are going to come walking in the middle of your experience or whatever.
Right.
So that's part of the structure that enables people to really sink into the couch. We use kind of a living room environment at Hopkins in most places. And it's just a nice, lying on a nice couch with some, I'm really partial for colored flannel sheets, you know. Goes back to my northern Michigan childhood, but I feel extra secure with them somehow, you know. And you just lie on the couch with headphones and eye shade and let the inner world manifest itself, you know. And we choose music as wisely as we can, and the music provides a kind of nonverbal support mechanism, even though at times you may be so deeply into the experience that you don't even hear the music, you know?
Right, or you are the music.
Or you are the music, or whatever. But I think of it as like a safety net for a trapeze artist. You know, if you need it, it's immediately there. You know? If you don't need it, you forget about it. You know,
and there's so much intention around this. So much there's preparation.
Yeah.
There's like a training of sorts and like an integration, and it's something that's distinct from what we think of medicine normally. You know, where it's just this biochemical thing that does a thing to me. You're actually with a psychedelic participating, and the psychedelic's doing something.
That's right.
But you have to actually be doing the work yourself, or in some way, it's almost the submission is the doing is almost a not doing in a way, is the letting happen. But that is something people aren't always accustomed to doing.
Yeah, it may be a slight overstatement, but not much. That what the psychedelic does is really simply unlock the door to the unconscious or the deeper levels of our being. And what you do when that door is open depends on who you are and your capacity to trust and your courage when it comes to exploring. If you see imagery of staircases and tunnels, you just stand there and look at them and say, what interesting staircases. Or do you say, I'm going to find out where they go, you know? Or if there's a tunnel, do you go through it, or do you just look at the door, you know? And they're kind of images like that are invitations to explore the mind. But you have to be ready for them, you know?
So, so what makes a good, therapist here?
A good therapist? I got a whole lecture on this. The most important thing is presence, of being able to be centered in the present moment, even if it's in silence. That you don't have to know what's going on every minute. Tell me where you are now. Tell me where you are now. It's hard to dissolve if you have to talk. But you're there to provide support if and when it's needed, but you don't need to be needed. You need to genuinely like people, I think, and very diverse and different people, and value incredible diversity in people, and not have an agenda to try to make something happen, but to just be with a person. And with that deep interpersonal acceptance, the human mind choreographs experiences. And what emerges is generally infinitely better designed than anything you could have planned in advance. That, Carl Jung realized this, that there is a part of us that's incredibly creative. And it's not just, college graduates, it's people who flunked out of junior high school too, And it's there. And when you trust it, it's a healing process from within that emerges. And as the therapist or guide or shaman or whatever we want to call that role, you get to witness it. But you don't cause it or bring it about. You know?
You're wanting to help someone to get in the way of actually helping them.
Yeah. One of the most important marks of a good therapist is to know when not to say something.
Right.
To just sit on your own meditation cushion and do some deep breathing, and you'll hear about the content later in the day or the next day, but don't get in the way.
Right.
You know?
Right. And so another thing, as far as what makes a good guide, some things are different, say, in the older days than today. Was, way back it was sort of expected that, of course, you need to have your own experience with psychedelics, and today not necessarily the case. What are your thoughts on that?
This is an area we're sorting out. The ideal, certainly in training anyone who's going to work with psychedelics clinically, would be to have their own experience.
Right.
And it's kind of ridiculous that if you can't find a legal research project you can qualify for right now, you have to go to South America to take ayahuasca, or mountains of Mexico to take psilocybin mushrooms or something. And I think that's just a transitional phase we're going through. Okay. In the early days, in Germany, to my own history, of course, it was perfectly legal then. And in fact, Leuna, before I left Germany, I wanted one final session. He said, "You can have whatever you want in whatever dose. Just tell me. Just write up a good report." That would be quite unthinkable now, but that I was within the University Department of Psychiatry. It was very responsible and legitimate. And then in Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, Spring Grove days, we wouldn't allow a new employee, even a psychiatric nurse, in the room if he or she hadn't had 2 LSD sessions, which was part of on-the-job training that we provided. And there was a feeling that in order to really be empathic and to be sensitive to what potentially is going on in the mind of the volunteer, you need to have some experience of these radically alternative states of consciousness yourself. Right. Now at Hopkins, we have not yet asked permission from the Institutional Review Board to train our own staff. I think that day is coming. MAPS has done it. With MDMA, and they train their own therapists.
And you were part of designing that protocol.
I was able to help that happen.
So
with
MAPS
MDMA.
therapists in training get to take MDMA.
So what we do, when people at Hopkins, research volunteers ask, have you taken the drug yourself? Our classic answer is, all of our clinical staff have experience in other states of consciousness. And whether it came through psychedelics or meditation or natural childbirth or the runner's high or creative performance, or you name it, that's their private business, which is a little defensive, but it's also the best we can do right now.
Political reasons for that, of course.
I mean, the political structures evolve, and I think as we present more and more data of safety, and it's more than safety, it's the real value of these states. And not only for medical treatment, but for education and religious lives. I think, what's the big deal? We're talking about a non-addictive substance given once that has a very good safety profile.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
why not?
And, coming back to the earlier discussion we were having around, since this is experiential medicine by its nature, it, to me, makes sense that someone who's acting as a guide has the experience themselves. Or to use your skiing metaphor, I want to get my ski instructions from someone who's been down the slope a time or two.
Or if you're going to be a Sherpa in the Himalayas, you want someone who's done some mountain climbing,
Exactly. And, I hope you're right. This is transitional. It's concerning to me, though, right? Because there are, with MAPS, as we mentioned, the therapists have the ability to have an experience. With psilocybin, though, not the case. And good news with psilocybin is you're personally developing this training with Compass Pathways, who's bringing this to market. But those therapists in training don't have the same opportunity as of yet to receive the psilocybin. Are you concerned about that at all?
Well, Compass Pathways, for example, did a study with normal volunteers that many of their therapists could apply for. Some got rather low doses, some got higher doses. But there was some opportunity to legally participate. And I think we can design respectable research projects that add to our knowledge and at the same time provide learning opportunities for staff. A number of our studies at Hopkins, as you know, have been done with so-called normal, healthy people. And big meditation studies with people who have never meditated before. And the advanced meditator study that'll be published probably in the year ahead. And our work with religious professionals and so on. There's no apology about giving it to people who aren't sick. And then healthy. Bob Jesse calls it using psilocybin for the betterment of well people. And it needs to be done skillfully. And it's not for everyone. But for those who desire this path of kind of facilitating personal and spiritual growth, why should it not be legally available?
I think it should be. Personally, I think it should be a requirement, like it was back in the day. You have to have your 2 LSD experiences before you can be in this room. That's my personal thought. Is you should have an experience before guiding someone.
And yet there are people who have dropped acid 200 times and have yet to experience
not a sufficient condition
really meaningful. And there are people who have had one spontaneous mystical experience at 2 a.m. one morning for unknown reasons, perhaps their own brains or lung tissue generated a little more DMT than usual, and they had an incredibly meaningful experience. And I think of like one of my mentors, Abraham Maslow, who could just lie down in his backyard and have mystical experiences. And he never took a psychedelic, but he didn't need a psychedelic, you know? And there are people like that. Teilhard de Chardin, the great Jesuit paleontologist, who says we're all spiritual beings who are having physical experiences right now, you know? But as far as we know, he never took a psychedelic, but he, in the depths of his own spiritual life, he was able to tap into these incredibly meaningful forms of human awareness. You know?
Well, that's true. Can I ask you some more, maybe tougher questions around the topic of Compass?
Why not?
All right. So context for people who may not know all the background here, right? So as you mentioned, the 2 psychedelics are coming to market now, right? There's MDMA, which MAPS is kind of leading the charge. MAPS is a nonprofit organization that owns a public benefit corporation, and they're taking MDMA to market. But it's a closed loop system kind of within this nonprofit ecosystem, if you will. And with psilocybin, it's a little different story. And there's two entities, organizations working to bring psilocybin out. One is the nonprofit USANA, and one is the for-profit Compass. And there's been criticism put out there, and without going too in depth with it, folks who want to know can read. There's an article on Quartz that Olivia Goldhill wrote, and I can link to in the show notes. There's a lot of criticism, though. Some of it's just in general. What's the implication of there being a for-profit company, right? Bringing psychedelics to market. Will that move things in a direction we don't like, right? And then more specific critiques that were raised around, Compass initially was a nonprofit and then kind of switched gears into being a for-profit. Some folks who had helped in the early days felt misled. And then there's practices that are pretty standard actually in broader pharma, but that aren't necessarily congruent with the values that a lot of the existing psychedelic community believes in. For example, there's exclusive manufacturing agreements, patents, this sort of thing, which is all very standard in the pharmaceutical industry. But for the psychedelic community, which has a lot of values and open sourcing and these sort of ideals, that's kind of clashing a bit. So there's critiques around that. And so people are asking, hey, should we be concerned? So I just wanted to ask you, what's your thoughts on all this?
I think the core is that, I personally know George Goldsmith and Katja Valley of Skova at Compass, and I know Bill Linton at USANA and his staff. And I have profound respect for all of them. There's no question in my mind that they are deeply spiritually awake human beings who care about improving mental health for the world. And they have, at this point in time, somewhat different administrative structures. Is profit or for-profit or not. George opted to go for-profit simply because the magnitude of funding that was required, he felt he would have a very difficult time coming up with in a nonprofit structure. But, if there are profits, if the value of the stock doubles, I would almost be certain that much of that profit will go right back into new psychedelic research. They don't want more yachts in the Caribbean, They're not self-centered businessmen,
Sure.
And the inferences to that extent on Facebook and so on have really been embarrassing. I think apologies are in order. I also feel philosophically two thoughts. One is that I think the dance of Shiva includes economic forces.
Sure.
That economic forces aren't necessarily evil,
Right.
And also there is a real place for good relations with the FDA and the EMA and speaking their language and creating GMP, good manufacturing practices, psilocybin. When I go to an emergency room, if I'm in pain, I'm very happy to get a dose of Dilaudid or Demerol or morphine, where I know the purity of the substance and the exact dosage. That doesn't mean that someone couldn't grow their own poppies and make their own opium.
Yeah. Well, like, you know, that's true, although it could. If there's an incentive for someone has the market on
Right.
psilocybin, could they have incentive to block people from growing their own mushroom? You know, these are some of the,
The mushrooms are growing everywhere.
Oh, that's true. That's
true. I don't know how you would ever block the growing of mushrooms,
It would be difficult.
But I think that's kind of unnecessary meddling almost. And it's also not comprehending what George Goldsmith especially is expert in, which is dealing with the regulatory agencies in different countries, speaking their language and having their support and approval to do psilocybin research, Right. That's a real art.
Right.
And there are many of us who care about the psychedelic frontier, and there are many languages to speak, right. And there are many gifts that are needed,
Yeah.
And I see no reason why, for those who want to fight for the freedom to grow your own shrooms in your closet, go for it, If you can get legal clearance for that, as, in the city of Denver or whatever, fine. But then, of course, you got to teach people how to do it right.
Right.
Right. Or it's going to be, it's like if you're going to go skiing, you got to have some lessons,
Yeah.
And but we don't make skiing illegal because some people
right. No, that's the thing.
Injure themselves,
And to me, that's what's important,
Yeah, that's right.
I would like to see a world where, okay, great, we've got the FDA-approved GMP stuff, and we're not going to arrest you for growing mushrooms.
That's right. What drives me personally, as I mentioned earlier, I found working with these cancer patients, end-of-life issues, just so incredibly meaningful. I think it could change the way the whole culture approaches death, really, ultimately. There's no need for all this depression and withdrawal and pain that so many people go through.
Right.
But for that to really happen, oncology centers need to have palliative care centers where they can legally provide psilocybin,
right.
With skilled people, in the right dose, in the right purity, and it needs to be covered by Medicare. It needs to be fully incorporated. So, as I'm fond of saying, the poor inner city resident who is suffering, whether from addictions or anxiety at end of life, who doesn't have a tie-dyed T-shirt, and can't spell psilocybin, and isn't interested in learning how to spell psychedelic,
right.
and will never go to a rave, But for those people to legally be able to receive this treatment,
Yeah.
I want to see that before I die. But that entails patience, protocols, reports to the FDA, dealing with institutional review boards,
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And that's really beautiful wish to bring out into the world, and you've been working at that. This has been your life's work. So thank you for for all of your work.
Well, there's a whole army of people building on
Yeah.
those earlier contributions. You should see the students graduating from the California Institute of Integral Studies, where we have this 9-month certificate program in psychedelic therapy and research. The 4th class is just finishing. A third of them are physicians, and many of them are, full professors, oncologists in their 50s, whatever, that there's a lot of very dedicated, responsible people in this field now.
Yeah.
And it's not going to go away.
Yeah. So where do you see it, I guess this is a good closing sort of question is, where do you see this going? Where's the future of all this? You've got all these new therapists. You've got the Hopkins Center researching things like Alzheimer's and eating disorders, even Lyme disease. Where do you see you mentioned the word frontiers earlier. I know and you have several chapters in the book about this. Where do you see all this going? What do you want to see? What lies ahead for this psychedelic movement?
I think first is the medicalization and the approval within medicine. I think that's the way our culture functions, But down the road, eventually, legalization, at least for use within centers that can provide medical screening, good preparation, pure drug in the proper dose, group support in integrating experiences afterwards. It's not just having the great experience, but what do you do with it? The old saying, it's easy to love all mankind, but try loving your spouse and your boss. That's a little more challenging.
Right.
And I, in my more idealistic moments, I hope of a time when consciousness will evolve so that awareness of the eternal, if you will, for want of a better word, or the infinite, and awareness of the everyday nitty-gritty world of time can exist side by side. The knowledge that comes out of these profound peak experiences, to use Maslow's term, is really profound. That it has to do with love, not as a mushy emotion, but as a intelligent energy at the very core of being. Like Dante's at the end of the Divine Comedy says, it is love that moves the sun and other stars. It's pretty profound. The insight about the interrelatedness of us all, of the family of man. Pretty profound implications for world peace.
Yeah.
The insight that within each of us are incredible resources. And that's why this is so effective in the treatment of addictions. Once an addict has had what we call a mystical experience or anything close to that, he or she can't claim to be worthless anymore.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your work. Really being that bridge. You've been at this for a really long time. In the early days when we didn't even know what the hell these things were. And then going through these dark periods and sort of...
Well, I take a little caution here because these drugs aren't new.
Right, that's true.
They've been around at least 2,000 years,
Yes.
and
Thank
probably
you for
5,000, maybe
right.
since the dawn of man.
Right.
And they arise in
Yes.
cultures, and then they get repressed. And they arise, and they get repressed.
Right.
Right? Right now, in our culture, they're arising.
Mm.
Back in the 60s, we weren't ready for them yet, and we got scared, and we did all kinds of stupid things, both with drugs and without drugs. But I think now the emergence of the psychedelics in society is being received very, very differently than in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
There's not this talk of jumping off skyscrapers and having deformed babies and all this scarce tactics, some of which even appeared in government pamphlets back in the 1960s. And it was just ignorant. It came out of fear.
Right.
It came out of social forces, the Vietnam War and the changing role of women and changing sexual mores, all kinds of social change all at once. And somehow LSD became the symbol of that.
Right.
We're at a very different place now. And in the last 20 years, as our studies at Hopkins have been published, the press has almost universally responded in a respectful, responsible way. There's just been none of the old sensationalism, or very, very little, And there's a dignity to the field, and very ordinary people are talking about their benefit. You don't have to be a hippie in Golden Gate Park,
Right. Right. Well, it's certainly an exciting time now.
Yeah.
And
well, thanks for what you're doing, Mike. I mean, you're kind of the jolly Johnny Appleseed going around here, But interviews like this, I think, do serve to educate. Many of those who are watching this will never read our articles in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. It costs $100 to subscribe.
Right.
But I think this is a genuine contribution, and I hope my book helps people as well. I think it is.
Yeah.
It's meant to be concise and simple in its language, but we really are on an incredible frontier.
Yeah, we are.
And I called the book, incidentally, Sacred Knowledge, building on William James, who talked about the noetic quality of mystical experience. That it's more than just a lot of positive emotion, but there's really intuitive knowledge.
Right.
And it's knowledge that, if applied and integrated, could be very influential in helping our species survive right now, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for those kind words. And thank you. I mean, you've been a big part of my being able to do this work. Is early on, when I was just throwing some events in Baltimore a few years ago, you were immediately helpful and receptive, and agreed to do an event with me, years ago. And you've been a huge help, and you're receiving me in your home and just have these kind of chats. And you've been really hugely helpful to me personally, and your work more broadly has been hugely helpful for this movement and for the broader world. All these really big things about humanity you're talking about. So thank you so much for everything that you've been doing. And
I almost feel we haven't talked much about dangers of the unwise use of psychedelics. And I wouldn't want this program to go out to the world without that word of caution.
Yes,
that there are people for whom the use of psychedelics carries a higher degree of risk.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And some of those people with family members who have been psychotic, histories of psychoses, brain tumors, acute heart conditions, etc. Frankly, we don't know yet if there are ways that psychedelics might be helpful to some of those people, because we haven't gotten around to doing those research projects yet, you know. But a word of caution is, you know, it's so much more than just throwing the drug in your mouth and seeing what happens. You really need to know what you're doing and be prepared and have a relationship with someone that really grounds you for maximal safety and efficacy. You know?
Thank you for that reminder. I think that's, as far as, like, you know, providing educational content, it's really important that we not just speak about the benefits and mystical experiences and all this, but there's another side to it, and it's really important. And so thank you for bringing that up. It is really important to always keep in mind that this isn't just like all good. Like, these are powerful tools, and they're
incredibly powerful tools.
Yeah,
and that's what makes them so valuable.
Power is a lot of things.
They really are sacred molecules.
Yeah.
And maybe all molecules are sacred in some sense, but some are more sacred than others. And psilocybin, and which of course breaks down into DMT. These substances need to be viewed with deep respect and care. Yeah.
And that's I think that's a pretty good note for us to leave our viewers on. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this interview with Bill Richards. His book is Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics and Religious Experiences. If you enjoyed this interview, help us do more of it. You can support us at Patreon, patreon.com/psychsems, PSYCHSEMS. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you again to our sponsor, Robert Barnhart. Check out his film, A New Understanding, The Science of Psilocybin. And of course, a big extra warm thank you to Bill Richards for this interview today. Namaste. May the force be with you.